Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulses, how about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Sufjan Stevens, titled Carrie Lowell. Man, it's taken me way too damn long to get to this review, especially considering this is a guy I've been wanting to talk about for a while now, but I've always had a hard time kind of nailing him down because of the many artists that I've talked about on this show. Sufjan Stevens is damn close to being one of a kind, and for the longest time I had just ignored him because of my first few listens through his debut album. He was just another quirky singer-songwriter from the indie scene that had a lot of critical acclaim and little else that really managed to stick with me. And man, after I dug deeper into his discography, I was wrong in spectacular fashion. After a hard left turn to weird electronica, he dropped the absolutely incredible record Michigan, a tribute to his home state that has such an incredible balance of sound and tone. It's amazing, fantastic record. He might not be the biggest presence as a singer. One of the reasons I found him difficult to get into in the past is that he tended to feel a little bit overtaken by his instrumentation, but his writing and his hooks were so impressively detailed and eclectic, with a vibrant energy and life that made the odd kitschy nature of his instrumentation incredibly endearing to me. Is it a little bit overlong, kind of off kilter, and oddly corny at points? Well, yeah, but I didn't mind it because the songwriting was so well grounded and very human that it just managed to click for me incredibly well. Ever since then, though, Sufjan Stevens' work has struggled to recapture that balance for me. The closest came on Seven Swans, which eased things back perhaps a little bit too much to bring the songwriting into tighter focus, which I'll admit managed to work for me because most albums exploring religion with Stevens' complicated brand of framing have a lot of potential to really connect, but his follow-up State album Illinois went in the absolute opposite direction, and it was even more elaborate, and while it did hit some spectacular highs, it didn't quite stick the landing as well. And then came the Age of Odds, a weird, warped little record diving back into electronics in a way that felt even more garish and gaudy than before. And honestly, it doesn't quite work, but there are some good moments on there. Overall, it's a good album. So when I heard that Sufjan Stevens was stripping things back down to folk again and opting for a much tighter, more personal focus, I was really looking forward to it, especially considering the titular characters of his late mother and stepfather placed in greater focus. Of course, there will always be moments of indulgence that are the quintessential parts of this record. Come on, it's Sufjan Stevens. But it's been over a decade since Seven Swans and he's gone in this folk direction. So, what did Sufjan Stevens deliver as he came home? Well, I'll say this. He delivered with Carrie Lowell a genuinely beautiful, thought-provoking, very heartfelt record that I have no qualm saying is absolutely excellent, but it's also the sort of album that I will only revisit when I have to this year. By that I mean that it's a hard record for me to really listen through. Not that it's bad or even all that challenging from an intellectual standpoint in understanding it, but that the emotional undercurrents and themes of this record make it kind of an uncomfortable listen for me. Listening through this album, it feels like I'm listening to somebody's very private experience in a confessional, and I'm no priest, which makes judging this album even harder because it feels like I'm judging something that's very real and personal to the guy. In other words, I think I can appreciate and respect this record a heck of a lot more than I outright love it, which means I'm not going to say it's one of the best of the year, but I can't say that it's not worth your time. So let's start with the areas where I can be a little bit more critical, and let's start with Sufjan Stevens himself. On this record, his long-held love for Paul Simon becomes so obvious and not even funny, and that quiet despair of his reserved delivery evokes a pretty potent brand of empathy for me. I talked yesterday in my Chris Stapleton review that it's often better to go over the top than undersell things, but Sufjan brings a layer of subtlety to his performance that not only supports his writing, but brings an additional context from his delivery. Sure, his voice might not be the greatest, and his falsetto might feel thin and wavering, and his emotive range might seem narrow, but it works here because it's very clear very early on that so much of it is a breaking at the seams. What isn't breaking is the instrumentation, which might have stripped things down to acoustic guitars, pianos, and hints of spacious effects, but it's still recognizable as a Sufjan Stevens work, and there is that foundational element. The tones are clean without feeling polished, the piano and guitars are warm without breaking or feeling chintzy, and the supple melody lines when they come through are absolutely gorgeous. The opening track, Death with Dignity's echo with the guitar and the piano over the bridge, it's masterful. The layered guitars of All of Me Wants All of You is so eerie and striking. 4th of July's ghostly swell has some of the most tasteful usage of reverb to accent a hushed, isolated piano line that I've heard all year. And then you have the instrumental interlude midway through The Only Thing, which takes the song's uncomfortable and intentional disconnect between gentle instrumentation and lyrical self-destruction and interjects this gorgeous acoustic touched guitar swell as the multi-tracking on the vocals thickens. God damn, that sounds good. Then there's the mournful synth outro on Carrie Lowell, the perfect somber punctuation to a shattered relationship that might never repair, the gentle piano melody behind the muffled percussion of John My Beloved, and especially that muted piano of Blue Bucket of Gold that fades into these waves of shimmering and guitar that fade into echoing voices amidst the wall of sound that, nevertheless, manages to give no clear, concrete vocal answer. If I'm going to complain about anything in the instrumentation, it'd be, like with most Sufjan Stevens records, that it feels a little bit indulgent at points. Yeah, even as stripped back as it is, I get the feeling that a slightly tighter edit might have helped even further, maybe emphasizing those melodic elements even further, especially considering the very muted and understated tone of this album. It's not one that builds to climaxes and moments of startling clarity, but then again, that's kind of the point. And yeah, now at this point we have to talk about lyrics and themes. And here's the thing, this might be one of Sufjan's most plain-spoken and personal records in a long time. Talking about his intimate framing even tighter as we gaze into his own life. And the first thing that I notice is that the sequencing in this album at first glance seems kind of odd. Namely that it seems to start at a moment of acceptance and then begin to break down from there. In other words, the complete opposite of the typical grieving process. But it's all the more human for it. It almost seems like Sufjan's unpacking his own grief and emotions and feelings surrounding his mother, and by extension his faith, which he openly questions on this album with a depth and a frankness which I really did appreciate. What's immediately interesting is that for as much as Sufjan puts a face on his resolve very early on, his relationship with his mother was complicated. She was reckless, she abused drugs, she left his siblings behind once in a video store, and the implication on the title track is that she might have actually broken his arm once. There's unresolved anger and bitterness that he's kept penned away for so long and never got a chance to express. And though I'd argue that this album's composure never really quite breaks for me, it doesn't shy away from letting it really come to the surface, all those emotions. But then again, Sufjan isn't shy about admitting for his distance didn't help matters, as he found it all the harder to care on songs like All of Me Wants All of You. And that's a really human thing to say when she is being that reckless and running away from him even faster. But it runs deeper than that when we get to Sufjan's relationship with God. You can default to thinking that his angst on this album links back to the classic question of why bad things happen to good people. But he's aiming for something deeper, the concept of faith and unrequited love. Even though he might not respect his mother, he still does love her, and it's still a relationship to which he feels compelled to contribute. He wants to give him himself here. And it's the same thing with faith. In the face of that implacable truth that is death, which is referenced but never really dwelt upon in detail in this album, which I actually found really interesting, he puts his faith in a higher power, praying for some sort of solace, and yet it's not coming. And here's where I think Sufjan does something really special. He doesn't take the coward's way out in this sort of conversation, because I've seen so much bad Christian music that just points towards faith and say that's enough. But Sufjan doesn't give us that happy ending because his mother is still dead, and even as his behavior deteriorates, as he's struggling to get through, things aren't getting better. There's a line in Drawn to the Blood that I really love, even though I don't really love the song. Delilah, avenge my grief. He calls upon the woman who made Samson just like any other man by chopping off his hair to do something against a higher power, strike back. And yet, that sort of task is just futile. The myth of Icarus is referenced in a very similar symbolism on John My Beloved, a man constantly reaching for the sun of enlightenment, only for it to burn away the wax of his wings. If we're looking for a theme on this album, it seems to be surrounding in this sort of futility, both in the face of death and in the face of God that doesn't really answer. And I absolutely love the ending track, Blue Bucket of Gold, mostly for a few lyrics. The first being, once the myth has been told, the lens deforms as lightning. In other words, whatever perception of higher power that comes beyond death is going to be warped by your own experience, and we'll never fully understand it, even if there is nothing to understand. Note the word myth used here. And yet we still cling for it anyway. We crave that lightning, that hope, that deeper understanding that might be abhorrent to real reason, but in the face of the impossible that can't be reasoned with, for what else can we go for? And what I love about this album is that Sufjan leaves the question open. There is no easy answer, and for a record that spent its length breaking its composure that it can't resemble, and that's arguably the hardest thing to take. And that's why, while I respect the hell out of this record, and I think it's damn great, and maybe close to being one of the best of this year in many other people's eyes, it's also the sort of album that I'll find hard to revisit. And it's not the only album that left open questions that came out in 2015. Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly left all sorts of open questions for the world at large open that have no easy answer. But there was a core to that record, an arc that made you feel that there might be a way to solve it. There was some hope. It wouldn't be easy, but there was a way. Carrie Lowell doesn't even give you that. There's no closure to it, which of course is very, very human, because life seldom gives that final easy answer, especially with grief and especially with God. And yet, that's kind of hard to take because on some level, you want to believe humanity is more than just staring into the void, praying for an answer that might never come. Hell, I get the feeling Sufjan wants to believe that more than anybody on this record. So, back to the album itself. Carrie Lowell is a harrowing release and downright excellent, but when moments of humanizing detail like references towards Casper and leaving behind a video store or him masturbating, they end up adding intellectual space and adding a little bit of distance from that raw emotion, you know you might have pushed a little bit too deep. And yet the strange thing is that I feel this album is slightly more gripping in its concept and execution. Maybe it's the instrumentation not really clicking, maybe it's his delivery, but I don't know, it doesn't always send the chill down my spine that I really want it to. So for me, it's an extremely strong 8 out of 10 and definitely a recommendation, but a conditional one. If you're a person of faith like I am, or you've recently lost somebody close to you, then this will not be an easy listen, I can say that. But then again, it's humanity, and it's art. It's not supposed to be easy. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yes, I know this review is extremely late. I really struggled with this album for a long time. So I still don't think I got all of it. But what do you guys think? If you guys thought you have any other interpretations, I'd be glad to hear it. Otherwise, if there's any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, or anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.
The fables to life.